Now that demeanor of his character, whom he was, devotion to duty and things of that sort, was throughout his life. And was it relevant to specific actions that you might give us an idea about?
When you think about, I guess the easiest way to illustrate that is the choice of choosing the Union versus Virginia, because that is certainly a place where a rough and tough decision has to be made. I don't think there's any question that Thomas did not have animus towards the South. He did not have an animus towards, certainly not towards Robert E. Lee. They had been associates in a wide range of events and lifetime activities. Lee had been superintendent at West Point, and one of the things that Thomas had done in his career was to teach artillery and horse tactics under Lee. And Lee argued, I need him to stay, when the service was asking him to be transferred elsewhere. They both served on the court-martial circuit in Texas. I can't imagine something more tedious than that, to be out in Texas on the plains and then running from court-martial to court-martial to court-martial. But there seemed to be a connection there, a personal connection between the two. And Mrs. Thomas came to spend some time there, and I think Lee, as much as anything, took concern about her welfare and took concern about making sure that she was comfortably settled, because, as he said it, the Major and I, talking about Thomas and myself, Robert E. Lee, this is our job, this is our service, this is what we do, so we're used to roughing it, we're used to doing whatever has to be done. I want better for Mrs. Thomas, she's not used to that. So the question about duty and what that duty's to, the Constitution, the oath he took, everything that connected him to the United States, he felt that superseded any other connection.
Yet he was looking at VMI beforehand. There was a possibility of him going to VMI, and he did look at that and
That's right.
talk to other Southern friends.
That's right. The VMI story is kind of easy to talk about because it's one of those circumstances that also explains a little bit about the way he operates during the war physically, and I'll explain what I mean by this. On his way back from Texas, he is going to stretch his legs at Lynchburg, Virginia. He steps off. It's late in the day. It looks like it's very dark. It looks like the shadows are there, but he's assuming the shadows are substance. He's assuming that there's land underneath, ground underneath, solid ground. And he steps off and falls into a ravine, an embankment. And as he falls down, he wrenches his back, so that there's a real doubt, because of the severity of the injury, whether active service will even be possible from here forward. So then the question is, if I'm going to, as Thomas and his wife would say, make a living, pay the bills, if I'm going to do that, what am I going to do if I can't actively serve any longer? And that's when he began to explore other possibilities, including the VMI position, which would have been a teaching position. He had been an instructor at West Point. It made sense for him to teach, if he could, at VMI. And so he did very much look into that as a possibility. Ultimately, that wasn't a possibility that panned out for him any more than the inquiries into potential service for Virginia. Those just didn't work out, and there was never...
Didn't work out because of him or because of...
Well, timing as much as anything else. I think most of what's happening is also happening when the country itself is literally unraveling. Mm-hmm. And so Thomas actually, I think, recovered sufficiently enough that he could go to back onto active duty, and this sort of made the rest of it moot. I am remaining with the Union. That is my choice. A lot of arguments are about whether Frances put pressure on him. She says that, that's Mrs. Thomas, says that they never talked about it, much less discussed that in any detail. They never even talked about it.
And she was okay with that decision.
Oh, she was not distraught by that because, of course, she was from Troy, New York, and New York connections. And
because with Lee, you write quickly in here how it was said that Lee, he went with the South and went to war to avoid conflict, and that means his wife.
His marital conflict,
That's
right. Well, Thomas didn't have to worry about that.
No, he didn't have to worry about that one.
Well, that answers one of my biggest questions about him, because I always have people who say, generally he had to go with the state, and I always say, well, there were other options, and so knowing about his wife now helps to answer that question.
Well,
a
now,
little
but
bit.
she would be offended because she wouldn't want you to think she unduly influenced
Yeah.
him. But for those of us who are married, and I am married, so for those of us who are married, we know that our wives have a tendency to make known their feelings sometimes, whether the statements are made directly or not. So I'm sure that the Thomases were a happily married couple, and I'm sure they understood each other well.
Glenn, you spoke earlier about military necessity, which is
Right.
what brought about Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
Do you think that, I should ask, do you think that Lincoln then was forced into glory, as it has been
Well, I know where
said,
that question's coming from.
as one detractor
Right,
put it?
right.
Or do you think that there was more to it than that?
Well, there's two camps on this. There's those who want to see Lincoln as being someone that was always committed to using his presidency for emancipation, and that he was sort of spending his time in the early part of the war calculating about just exactly when he would be able to do it, and when the moment was right, and when the political situation and the military situation came in, and he was always sort of looking for that opportunity. And then on the other hand, as you mentioned, there are those who say, this is a guy who never really had a heart for emancipation, never really had a heart for African Americans, and so he was just kind of forced into it. Well, I kind of take the middle ground on this. I think that Lincoln, it's clear that Lincoln in his entire political career was someone who believed slavery was wrong. Of course, his famous quote, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." He's a gentleman that always wanted to see it eliminated from this country. It's what drew him to the Republican Party. Hopefully by stopping the expansion of slavery, it would ultimately wither on the vine and die out. So I think he's a man who had a long history of wanting to see slavery end in this country. But at the same time, as a lawyer, he's a man who understands the constitutional limitations. Probably his devotion to the Constitution and law supersedes any desire to end slavery in the country. So he understands that while his heart may want to do something, the reality is that legally he can't. Well, what the war does is through it becomes obvious that to a lot of people that freeing the slaves is going to be necessary to end the war. Plus, it gives him the legal justification to free the slaves. That's what leads to his decision. But I don't see him as someone that didn't really enjoy the fact that all these factors came together, and didn't really enjoy the fact that he was able to do this. So I try to find the middle ground. He's someone that's opposed to slavery, but really enjoys the fact that the war has now given him the opportunity to actually do it. So he's not forced into glory.
Okay.
It would be my answer to that question.
I don't think that at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop either, frankly. I'm going to ask you a war question. In August of 1855, Lincoln wrote to George Robertson, a political ally of his, and he said that basically he privately thought, and he said that there's no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. 1,000 signs extinguishes that hope utterly. Do you think he helped force war because he thought maybe that might end slavery?
No, I think that would be taking things way too far. And again,
I'm trying to.
And maybe that probably goes into that category of what I was saying earlier of people who want to see him sort of the whole time manipulating events so that he could bring about emancipation. Well, what you're saying here, that takes it back even further. It takes it back to 1855 and has him engineering things. I don't think in 1855 Abraham Lincoln ever envisioned that he would be president of the United States.
No, I don't think it was engineering, but
Right.
I think that was his private thought. I asked James McPherson sitting in that seat, and he thought that everything else showed that he really didn't think that. This is the only moment he did. To me, that's the first time, and maybe the only time, that Lincoln actually unveiled his private thought.
Right.
What he really thought it was going to take for slavery. Not that he was going to bring it about or could.
Right.
No, I don't think that either.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get your reaction.
Well,
to that.
yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind is, the abolitionists for a long time had been leaning on something that John Quincy Adams had argued, many years earlier, and that was that he pointed out that if there is ever going to be a chance to free slaves in this country, it's probably going to be through war. because then the president would be able to use war powers. And so abolitionists have been talking about this for a long time. And I'm not saying that Abraham Lincoln was a big fan of abolitionists, because he definitely wasn't, but that may have been what might have been influencing, his comments there that you mentioned.
Now, the abolitionists, and we wrote that, and then we'll go back to
All right.
Thomas too, that they, first of all, I mean, there are two questions here and two long questions, so maybe I'll go to the abolitionists first. That the slave population there, and the first question I'll ask later, is that it was a different sort of population. They were almost ready for emancipation. They were, they knew different skills. They had skills that maybe were not throughout the slave population in the South, and they could be induced a little more quickly. The abolitionists, how did they induce? John Sherman, William Tecumseh's brother, wrote to him and said, "Did the radical and that we must seek the aid and make it the interest of the Negroes to help us."
Right.
And so, how did the abolitionists reach out to the blacks, to those who were already freed, those who were contraband, to try to get them, induce them to come out? I know that there was this small Proclamation of Emancipation that came out. It's a very small pamphlet that is very difficult to find today, even though thousands, I think, were actually taken out there, but you don't see it today. And that's one of the inducements, I think. What else did they do to try to induce the contraband to come over?
Well, I would think that most of what you're talking about would probably have taken place in the contraband camps, because the abolitionists became very active in going to the contraband camps and trying to bring some humanitarian aid and to educate the slaves, teach them to read and write, and so probably a lot of discussion in the contraband camps. My book talks about the fact that very early in the war on the peninsula, where contrabands had first started to gather at Fort Monroe, that there was an officer by the name of Edward Pierce with a Vermont regiment who was very active in having conversations. Well, he had been given the job of organizing them as labor groups for the Union forces, and at night he would have long conversations with the enslaved community, and find out what their thoughts and feelings were. And what he discovered is that most of them already were seeing the war as a means of emancipation. So I'm not really sure how much abolitionists had to do with convincing the slaves that the war would lead to emancipation. I think they probably already understood that right from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And the more interesting thing to me about this is that I think the reason why they already understood that had a lot to do with the fact that they had heard conversations by their masters, leading up to the election of Lincoln, where they painted Lincoln as, this abolitionist who's going to ruin the South. He's going to, destroy slavery, and so we have to vote against this guy. And the slaves heard that and circulated it, through the community along the grapevine. So I guess my answer to your question is that I don't think that it was any abolitionists that came down and had to convince African Americans that this war could lead to their freedom if they did this, that, and the other. I think they already understood that, and of course the beautiful irony of it is that it probably came originally from their masters. So nice bit of karma there, I think.
Well, let me throw in a couple of thoughts that fit both of those issues. The issues of complexity, because really when you talk about all these people, whether they're abolitionists, slaves, whether they're George Thomas, whoever you're talking about, we have a tendency to simplify. And then when we do that, we lose the subtleties and nuances of the story. And one of the stories that comes from Chuckatuck, Virginia, is a story that I wrote.
That's quite a name, Chuckatuck.
Which comes from a book that I wrote called The War Hits Home. And in that book, it's had this person writing a letter to a cousin, and she says that the slaves don't follow simple instructions. When we tell them, do not go to the gates, it might be the Yankees, and they'll take you away. Every time after that, riders would come to the gates, they would rush to the gates.
Right.
They just didn't understand simple instructions. It might be the Yankees, and they'll take you away.
Right.
And, of course, we know who it was that didn't get it. But there is an interesting thing. Those slaves, not the ones who were already in the contraband camps, they had voted for freedom with their feet. But the ones that were there were waiting for someone to take them away. We forget that there's complexities. Some human beings are type A persons. Some are followers, and they wait to see how things are going to turn out. And that's when we'll work out what we do.
Right.
Is when we see how things turn out.
Right. Well, to comment on that, one of the things that masters had been almost to the point of obsession telling their slaves before the war is that Yankees were these evil people, that they were the devil that was going to come down here and take you away to Cuba and force you to work in Cuba, to try to scare the slaves. And of course, you're talking about people seeing things differently. Some of the slaves heard that and said, "That's crazy. I mean, obviously these Yankees must be an enemy to my master, and so they must be good people." But then there are others who may have listened to that and been suspicious that maybe Yankees were these bad people that their masters painted them out to be. And I found a lot of that when I was discussing the Peninsula Campaign of slaves who would ask newspaper reporters when they were having conversations with these journalists about what are the Yankees going to do with us. So there were clearly some who they had that little bit of suspicion in their mind that was put there by their masters.
Well, if you teach someone how to read the Bible because you feel responsibility for their soul, you can't control that they might then read a newspaper.
Right.
And there's a classic story of a slave who was reading a newspaper, and the master comes in, and the slave turns the newspaper upside down. And the master, who is convinced that this slave simply couldn't be doing what I thought they were doing, because every stereotype they live off of says this person is ignorant, this person
Right.
can't do
And of course,
this.
like you said, slaves would play into that.
Right.
Turning the newspaper upside
Right.
down or saying, "Massa, I don't understand nothing about no
Sure,
politics."
sure,
They
sure.
played that game.